The morning light filtered through the grimy windows of Rossi's café, casting long shadows across worn wooden tables. The smell of burnt espresso and stale croissants hung in the air like a permanent resident. This was Brooklyn, the real Brooklyn, where dreams came to work double shifts and still barely made rent. Clara Rossi moved through the narrow café with the practiced exhaustion of someone who had learned to make her body work, even when her mind begged for rest. 24 years old, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of 6 a.m. shifts and late-night community college classes, she existed in that strange liminal space where she was both everywhere and nowhere, visible only when something went wrong. Her uniform was coffee-stained at the cuffs, the name tag slightly crooked. Her dark hair was pulled back in a bun so tight it seemed to stretch her face into a perpetual expression of tension. The other waitresses at the café had learned long ago not to befriend Clara too closely. There was something about her desperate determination to survive that made them uncomfortable, a mirror they didn't want to look into. The morning had been chaos. A water pipe had burst in the back, soaking the storage room. 2 of the regular waitresses had called in sick. The owner, Vincent, a man whose patience seemed to have evaporated sometime in the 1990s, was in a mood that made everyone move faster and speak quieter. Clara had already dropped 1 full tray, 6 cappuccinos, 2 scrambled eggs, 1 short stack, sending ceramic shards across the black and white checkered floor like casualties of her incompetence. She wiped her hands on her apron and moved toward table 7, a corner booth that had been reserved since early morning. A phone call had come in. Important people, important business. Vincent had repeated the instructions 3 times. Coffee, fresh, strong. No mistakes, Clara, no mistakes. The words echoed in her head as she approached the table with a fresh pot of coffee in one hand and a stack of white porcelain cups in the other. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear exactly, but from the particular exhaustion of someone running on her 5th coffee of the morning and her 6th hour of work. That's when she noticed them. 4 men in dark suits, pristine and tailored in a way that screamed money and power. They didn't belong in this cafe. The other customers, construction workers, nurses on their break, elderly immigrants who came for the warmth and familiar faces, suddenly seemed to shrink in their presence. The ambient noise of the cafe didn't decrease, but it changed. It became cautious, measured. The men's faces were expressionless. Their eyes were everywhere at once, cataloging exits, movements, threats. They communicated with glances and subtle nods. One of them, a younger man with a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, kept one hand in his jacket pocket. Clara noticed these details the way prey notices the presence of a predator, not through analysis but through pure instinct. She had seen enough crime dramas with her mother to recognize the type. But this wasn't television. This was real. And they were in her cafe. The oldest of the 4 men sat with his back to the wall facing the entrance. He was perhaps 50, with silver threading through dark hair combed back from his forehead. His face had the kind of geometry that suggested generations of Italian lineage. Sharp cheekbones, a prominent nose, eyes that were an unusual shade of amber brown. He wore an expensive charcoal suit with a silk tie that probably cost more than Clara's entire monthly salary. Marco Bellini didn't look like a mafia boss. He looked like someone's well-tailored grandfather. He looked like the kind of man who would help old women cross the street. He looked like a man who went to church on Sundays and had framed photos of children on his office desk. None of this was true. Clara didn't know his name. She didn't know who he was. In her exhausted state, operating on autopilot and muscle memory, she simply saw a table of well-dressed men who needed coffee. She had done this 1,000 times. She could do it in her sleep. She almost was doing it in her sleep. The pot was full and hot. The cups were clean. Everything was normal. Everything was routine. Until it wasn't. It happened in the space between 1 second and the next, a moment so brief that afterward, Clara would struggle to understand exactly how it occurred. Her foot caught on the worn carpet near the booth. The heel of her shoe, already scuffed and damaged from 6 months of shifting tables and spilled food, caught in a frayed thread. She stumbled forward with the kind of clumsiness that belonged entirely to her, entirely to this moment. The pot tilted. The coffee spilled, but not onto the table, not onto the floor, where it could be cleaned up with paper towels and an apology. Instead, the entire contents of the coffee pot, approximately a liter of hot, dark liquid, poured directly across the lap and sleeve of Marco Bellini. The silence that followed was absolute. Every conversation in the cafe stopped mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Eyes pivoted toward the corner booth like an audience turning to watch the final act of a tragedy. The ambient noise of the city outside the windows seemed to recede, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Clara's vision seemed to narrow to a single point. The coffee pooled on the expensive charcoal suit, darkening the fabric, spreading across his leg and dripping onto the polished leather of his shoe. Steam rose from the wet fabric. The smell of burnt espresso intensified, suddenly overwhelming. Time did something strange. It stretched. The moment expanded, became elastic, became infinite. Clara's hands had dropped to her sides. The empty pot hung from her fingers. Her mouth had opened, but no sound emerged. Just a small, ineffectual gasp that seemed to come from somewhere very far away. Her face had gone pale, her dark eyes wide with the particular terror of someone who understood, with absolute certainty, that she had just made a catastrophic mistake. She waited for the explosion. Every fiber of her being braced for it. She had seen enough movies, heard enough stories. Men like this didn't forgive accidents. Men like this didn't appreciate carelessness. Men like this, and she understood this in the marrow of her bones, were dangerous. Marco Bellini sat perfectly still. His three companions leaned forward slightly, their bodies tense, their eyes alert. The scarred man's hand moved slightly in his jacket pocket. The tension in the booth had become almost visible, like a physical presence in the air. And then, something impossible happened. Marco Bellini smiled. It wasn't a cruel smile. It wasn't a smile that preceded violence or retribution. It was the kind of smile that might appear on someone's face while looking at a photograph of a grandchild, or while remembering a moment from decades past that had never quite lost its power to touch something deep in the chest. He looked at Clara's hands. They were shaking now, visibly trembling, the empty pot rattling slightly against the ceramic cup she was still somehow holding. He looked at her face, at the pale skin, the wide eyes, the open mouth frozen in an expression of pure terror. He looked at her as if he was seeing something in her that no one else had ever bothered to notice. And then he spoke. His voice was quiet. It didn't carry the threat of violence. Instead, it carried something else. Something that sounded almost like wisdom, almost like sorrow, as if he was imparting a lesson he had learned at great personal cost. "You should be more careful," he said, his accent barely perceptible, just a slight musicality beneath the English words. "Life can burn fast." He stood up slowly, brushing the coffee from his sleeve with the same deliberate calm he brought to every movement. One of his companions immediately moved to assist him, offering a napkin, muttering apologies, his body language communicating a readiness to handle whatever needed to be handled. But Marco Bellini waved him away. He was still looking at Clara. "It's just coffee," he said. "Nothing broken, nothing permanent, just coffee." And then he did something that would replay in Clara's mind for weeks, months, perhaps years afterward. He reached into his pocket and withdrew his wallet. He extracted several bills. Clara couldn't focus enough to see exactly how many, but the denominations seemed substantial. He placed them on the table on top of the spilled coffee, without counting them or seeming to care whether they got wet. "For the cleaning," he said, "and for the fear. Everyone deserves to be afraid sometimes. It reminds us we're alive." His companions gathered themselves, straightening their posture, following his lead toward the door. The younger man with the scar cast one final glance at Clara. Not threatening exactly, but assessing, remembering. The other two moved with the silent efficiency of people trained in the art of disappearing. Marco Bellini paused at the door. He turned back one final time, looked directly at Clara across the length of the cafe, and inclined his head slightly. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, of respect perhaps, or recognition. It was impossible to say exactly what it was, but it meant something. It definitely meant something. And then they were gone, disappearing into the Brooklyn morning, like a dark dream dissolving at dawn. The cafe erupted. Conversation exploded back into being, louder than before, as if everyone was trying to process what had happened by talking simultaneously. The construction workers exchanged glances. The nurses leaned in toward each other, whispering. Vincent emerged from the back, drawn by the sudden noise, and assessed the situation with the practiced eye of someone who had managed a restaurant in Brooklyn for 30 years. Clara remained motionless for a long moment, still holding the empty pot, still unable to move. Her heart was hammering so violently she thought it might break through her ribs. Her hands were shaking worse than before now that the immediate danger had passed, released from their frozen state. Vincent approached her slowly, as if approaching a frightened animal that might bolt at any moment. "Clara," he said quietly, "are you hurt?" She shook her head. She wasn't hurt. She was something else entirely. She was confused. She was shaken. She was experiencing something she couldn't quite name, a sense of having brushed up against something much larger than herself, something that operated according to rules she didn't understand. Who were they? She heard herself ask. Vincent's expression became carefully neutral. He took the empty pot from her hands and guided her gently toward a chair. "People it's better not to know," he said simply. "People it's better to forget about." But Clara understood in that moment that she would never forget them. She would never forget the kindness in eyes that surely had witnessed terrible things. She would never forget the way he looked at her, not as a servant who had made a mistake, but as something else entirely, something that mattered. And she didn't know it yet, but her life had already begun to change. Clara returned to her shift that morning, but nothing felt quite the same. She kept replaying the moment in her mind, trying to understand it. A mafia boss who smiled instead of destroying. A powerful man who offered kindness instead of cruelty. And those words, "Life can burn fast," seemed to carry a weight she couldn't quite shake. Question for you. What would you have done in Clara's place? Would you have forgotten this encounter? Or would you have let curiosity guide you toward answers? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel to find out what happens next. The story is just beginning. 3 days passed. 3 days in which Clara tried to return to her normal routine, to convince herself that the encounter had been an aberration, a strange moment that meant nothing. 3 days in which she worked her shifts, attended her evening college classes, and existed in that familiar space of quiet desperation. But the bills Marco Bellini had left on the table haunted her. They were still in the pocket of her apron, wrapped carefully in a napkin and hidden beneath her mattress at home. She hadn't dared to count them. The act of counting would make them real in a way that terrified her. The act of using them would mean she was accepting something she didn't understand. On the 4th morning, she arrived at Rossi's café to find Vincent waiting for her near the entrance. His expression was grave, and he held an envelope in his weathered hands. The color drained from Clara's face. She thought of her security deposit. She thought of something being wrong, something being broken. "Don't worry," Vincent said quickly, reading her panic. This is something else." He handed her the envelope. It was expensive paper, creamy and thick, with no marking or address. Inside, there was a handwritten note on a matching card. The handwriting was precise, elegant, the kind of script that suggested generations of education and formal training. "Miss Rossi, I find myself thinking of your trembling hands. I find myself remembering your fear, and also your resilience. In this business of ours, resilience is rare. Compassion is rarer still. I suspect you are wasting your potential in that cafe. I suspect you have larger dreams than refilling coffee cups. Should you wish to discuss opportunities that might better suit your talents, I have included an address below. No obligation, no pressure. Simply an open door, should you care to open it. Monsieur Bellini." Below the signature was an address in Manhattan. A restaurant, it appeared. Somewhere that belonged to a different world than the one Clara inhabited. Her hands began to shake again. This time, it wasn't fear that caused the tremor, but something more complex. It was the sensation of invisible forces moving in her direction. It was the feeling of being noticed by someone powerful, and the particular terror and exhilaration that came with that notice. "What do I do?" she asked Vincent, her voice very small. The old restaurateur considered her carefully. He seemed to be weighing something in his mind, measuring competing loyalties or fears. "That," he said finally, "is something only you can decide. But if I were a young woman with potential, with intelligence, with a hunger I could see from across a room, I think I would want to know what door had been opened for me." The address in Manhattan led to a restaurant called Acqua Alta, located in a historic building in Little Italy. Clara stood outside on the sidewalk, trying to gather the courage to enter. The neighborhood was a living museum of Italian-American history. Narrow streets, weathered facades, the smell of garlic and basil and aged brick mixing together into something that spoke of generations. The restaurant's windows were tinted, making it impossible to see inside. The door was polished wood with a brass handle. Everything about the place suggested that you didn't simply walk in. You were invited. You belonged, or you didn't. Clara walked in. The interior was exactly what she would have imagined a place like this to be. The walls were exposed brick and dark wood. The lighting came from ornate brass fixtures that cast warm amber light across linen-covered tables. The paintings on the walls were classical Italian landscapes, rolling hills, Renaissance architecture, scenes that belonged to a world before Brooklyn, before coffee spills, before her. It was early in the evening, before service, and the restaurant was mostly empty. A man in an expensive suit stood near the host stand. Not the scarred man from the cafe, but someone different, older, with gray at his temples and a bearing that suggested military training or its equivalent. "Miss Rossi?" he said, and it wasn't a question. He was expecting her. He had been told to expect her. She nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. "Mr. Bellini is in his office. He's been expecting you to arrive for 2 days now. He said you would come on the evening of the 4th day. He was correct, as always." This detail, that Marco Bellini had predicted her arrival so precisely, sent another wave of disorientation through Clara. How could he have known? What kind of man possessed that kind of insight? She was led through the restaurant, past the dining room, through a kitchen where chefs in white coats worked with practiced precision, to a hallway that led away from the public space. At the end of the hallway was a door made of dark wood with frosted glass panes. Through the glass she could see the silhouette of someone sitting at a desk. The man who had accompanied her knocked quietly. A voice from within called out permission to enter. He opened the door and gestured Clara inside, then closed the door behind her, leaving her alone. Marco Bellini sat at a desk that was itself a work of art. Italian leather, dark wood carved with intricate designs. Behind him the walls were lined with books. The window behind his desk looked out onto Little Italy's narrow streets. The office smelled of aged leather and quality tobacco, and something else. Something that spoke of old money, old power, old secrets. He looked up from a ledger he had been examining, and smiled the same smile he had offered her across the spilled coffee. It was a smile that seemed to contain within it a kind of sadness, as if he was remembering something painful, while simultaneously trying to be kind. "You came," he said simply. "I wondered if you would. I wondered if you would be brave enough, or foolish enough. Often the two are indistinguishable." Clara found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I don't understand. I don't know who you are. I don't know what this is." Marco Bellini gestured for her to sit in the leather chair across from his desk. She sat, perching on the edge of the seat, as if she might need to flee at any moment. "My name is Marco Bellini. Let us say I am a businessman. I manage various enterprises in this city, most of them legal, some of them less so." He said this with no shame, no apology. It was simply fact, stated without artifice. "I am also a man who has spent 53 years on this earth witnessing the capacity of humans to be cruel to one another. I have been myself quite cruel on numerous occasions. When you are in the business I am in, cruelty becomes a tool. It becomes necessary." He paused, studying her carefully, as if trying to determine whether she was capable of understanding what he was about to tell her. "But I am also a man who has been thinking lately about what I will leave behind when I am gone. Not money, not property. These things are nothing. What remains is the impact we have had on other people's lives, the choices we have made regarding their suffering, the opportunities we have offered them, or withheld." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street below. When he spoke again, his voice carried a quality that Clara hadn't heard before, something like regret, something like longing. "I saw you in that cafe," he continued. "I saw a young woman working herself to exhaustion, likely for very little money. I saw intelligence in your eyes and fear. I saw a person who had learned to make herself invisible because that was the safest strategy for survival. And I saw something else. I saw a person who still believed that kindness was possible, despite everything that had happened to her." He turned back to face her. "This is not an accident," he said. "The coffee, the way it spilled, none of this was accident. I test people. I have spent many years learning how to read human nature, how to see into the character of people who cross my path. Your clumsiness, it was real. Your fear, it was real. Your kindness, the way you prepared to apologize for something that was not truly your fault. Your readiness to accept blame and punishment. These things are rare." Clara's mind reeled. She tried to process what he was saying. Some part of her understood that this man was describing something darker than she wanted to believe, something that involved manipulation and control, but another part of her, the part that was exhausted and desperate and hungry for something more, wanted to hear what came next. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Not what you think," Marco said, returning to his desk. "I am not offering you a life of crime. I am not inviting you into my organization, though I suspect you have wondered if that is what this is. What I am offering you is something simpler and perhaps more valuable. I am offering you an opportunity to grow beyond where you are now. I am offering you education, financial support, and connections that will allow you to chart your own course in this world." He opened a drawer in his desk and withdrew an envelope similar to the one she had received from Vincent, but thicker, more substantial. "Inside this envelope is funding sufficient to allow you to attend university full-time, rather than working double shifts and taking evening classes. It is enough to pay for your rent, your food, your books. It is enough to give you time to think, time to study, time to become the person you have the potential to become." He slid the envelope across the desk toward her. "There is no debt attached to this money. No obligation, no expectation of repayment. It is a gift. I am offering it to you because I can, because I have far more money than I could ever use, and because I suspect that the universe occasionally requires those of us with resources to assist those of us without them." Clara stared at the envelope. It sat on the desk like a key, like a door, like a portal to a different life. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do this?" Marco Bellini sat back in his chair. For a moment, he looked very old, very tired, like a man carrying the weight of decades of choices, both good and terrible. "Because," he said slowly, "I'm trying to remember what humanity feels like. Because I am trying to be the kind of man that my mother believed I could become, before I chose a different path. Because you spilled coffee on me, and instead of being angry, I remembered that I once believed in mercy. And because, Miss Rossi, sometimes the best use of power is to help someone who cannot help themselves." Clara left Marco Bellini's office that evening with an envelope containing enough money to change her life. But with that money came questions. Questions about who Marco Bellini really was. Questions about what he wanted in return, what hidden strings might be attached to this gift. Questions about whether accepting this help would somehow mark her as part of his world, his criminal world, in a way she could never undo. For you, the viewer, if you received help from someone powerful and mysterious, would you be grateful, or would you be suspicious? What would you do? The story is getting deeper, darker, more complex. Subscribe now to make sure you don't miss what happens next. 6 months passed. 6 months in which Clara's life transformed in ways both obvious and subtle. She enrolled full-time at Hunter College, majoring in business administration with a minor in psychology. She moved to a small apartment in Murray Hill, Manhattan, close enough to campus to walk on good days. She stopped working at Rossi's café, though she visited Vincent occasionally, and each time she did, he looked at her with an expression that combined pride and concern. The money Marco had given her proved to be exactly as he had described. Sufficient, but not excessive. He seemed to have calculated precisely how much she needed and no more. It was, she eventually realized, a kindness of a particular type. It was help that didn't infantilize. It was assistance that acknowledged her agency, her capacity to make her own choices, even if those choices had previously been constrained by economic necessity. She saw Marco once during this period, at the restaurant Aqua Alta. He had invited her to dinner, a business dinner, he had explained when the invitation arrived. It turned out to be something else entirely, a private meal in a private room at the restaurant with Marco and 3 other people. A woman in her 60s with kind eyes, a man who introduced himself as the director of a scholarship program, and a young man who worked as a journalist for a major New York newspaper. During dinner, the conversation ranged across topics both serious and light: politics, culture, education. Marco guided the conversation with the skill of someone who had spent decades navigating complex social dynamics. He introduced ideas, asked questions, listened with genuine attention to the answers, and Clara realized during that meal something important. He was teaching her, not directly, not overtly, but through example. He was teaching her how to think, how to engage with complex ideas, how to navigate social situations with grace and intelligence. After dinner, he walked with her to her apartment, something that might have seemed dangerous or inappropriate to an outsider, but which felt natural, felt right. They walked through Manhattan's nighttime streets, past lit windows and closed storefronts, past the invisible architecture of a city that never truly slept. "How are your studies?" he asked. "Good," Clara replied. "Better than good. I have a 3.9 GPA. I've been invited to join the honors program." "This doesn't surprise me," Marco said. "You are intelligent. More importantly, you are disciplined. You understand that nothing is given, that everything must be earned. These qualities are rarer than intelligence, rarer than talent." They walked in silence for a block. "I want you to understand something," he continued. "The gift I gave you, it was not charity, it was not pity, it was an investment. I invested in you because I believed you had potential. I believed you could become someone. Now after 6 months I am satisfied that my instincts were correct." Clara felt a small knot of tension form in her stomach. She had wondered, during these 6 months, about the hidden cost. She had wondered when he would ask her for something in return. "You're wondering about the debt," Marco said, as if reading her mind. "You're wondering when I will ask you for repayment. You're wondering if this was a trap of some kind." "Yes," Clara admitted quietly. "I've wondered about that every day." "Good," Marco said. "That means you are intelligent enough not to accept gifts without question. That means you understand that in this world nothing is free. Everything has a price. That is wisdom." He stopped walking and turned to face her. They were standing on a quiet residential street, brownstones rising on either side of them, the city's ambient light creating a permanent dusk in the concrete landscape. "Here is the price," Marco said. "Here is what I ask of you in return for your education. I ask that you become someone. I ask that you graduate from Hunter College. I ask that you go on to do something meaningful with your life. I ask that you help other people the way I have helped you. That is all. That is the entirety of my request." Clara's eyes filled with tears. Tears of relief, tears of gratitude, tears of understanding. "Is it possible?" she asked. "Is it possible that someone could do something like this for no reason other than wanting to help?" Marco smiled that sad, wise smile. "It is rare," he said, "but it is possible. I am a man who has committed terrible acts. I am a man who has hurt people, people who did not deserve to be hurt. I am a man who operates in the shadows of this city, managing things that should not be managed, controlling things that should not be controlled. But I am also a man who, when faced with the choice to hurt or help, chose mercy, chose kindness." He reached out and gently touched her shoulder. "I am trying to balance the scales," he continued. "I am trying to do enough good to offset the harm I have caused. I do not know if it is possible. I do not know if goodness can truly outweigh darkness. But I know that trying is the only path available to me. And so I try." Then came the night that changed everything. It was a Wednesday in late November, cold and clear. Clara was studying in her apartment when she heard the sirens. Not unusual for Manhattan, but they seemed to multiply, to increase in density and urgency. She went to her window and looked down onto the street. Police cars, multiple of them, blocking the avenue. Officers moving with purpose. Something had happened. She learned about it the next morning from the news. There had been a shooting in Little Italy, early in the morning hours. A man, identified only as Marco Bellini, age 53, had been found in an alley near Mulberry Street. 2 gunshot wounds to the chest. Dead at the scene. No arrest made. Police were investigating, though gang violence was suspected. Clara's world seemed to stop. She sat on the edge of her bed, holding the newspaper in trembling hands, reading and rereading the brief account as if the words might change if she looked at them long enough. Marco Bellini was dead. The man who had given her everything, not everything but enough to build something from, was gone. She thought back to that conversation on the street. She thought about his words about trying to balance the scales. She wondered if he had known. She wondered if he had accepted that this price might be the cost of his life. The funeral was closed casket, held at a church in Little Italy. Clara attended, sitting in the back watching as men in expensive suits filed into the pews. She didn't approach them. She didn't speak to anyone. She simply sat and observed, trying to understand what Marco's death meant, trying to process the loss of someone who had been simultaneously important and peripheral in her life. In the days that followed, she tried to return to her normal routine. She attended classes. She studied. She tried to pretend that nothing had fundamentally changed. But everything had changed. Everything would continue to change. 2 weeks after Marco's death, she received another envelope. This one was hand-delivered by a man she recognized. The older man with gray at his temples who had welcomed her into Aqua Alta months earlier. Inside the envelope was a letter, written in Marco's precise, elegant handwriting. The letter was dated 3 days before his death. Dear Clara, if you are reading this, I am dead. This is not a tragedy. This is not unexpected. This is simply the price of the life I have chosen. I have always understood that my choices carried consequences, and I have accepted these consequences with the understanding that they might, one day, be exacted in this particular way. I want you to know that knowing you, watching you grow and transform over these months has been one of the great privileges of my life. You have shown me that it is possible to be kind in this world and still survive. You have reminded me of my humanity when it was easy to forget that I possessed such a thing. Do not waste your grief on me. Do not spend time wondering if you could have done something different. If our meeting was somehow meant to cause your pain. Our meeting was meant to liberate you. My death, when it comes, is separate from that liberation. My death belongs to me and to the choices I have made. Your life belongs to you and to the choices you will make. Use your education. Use the opportunities that have been given to you. Build a life that honors not just your own potential but also honors the belief I have in you. Be the kind of person who helps others the way I have helped you. Break the cycle. Show this world that goodness is not weakness, that kindness is not naivete, that it is possible to be strong and merciful simultaneously. I have arranged for continued financial support should you need it. This is provided by a trust fund in your name, managed by the man who will deliver this letter. You may access these funds for your education and for your living expenses through graduation. After that, I suspect you will not need them. Live well, Clara Rossi. Live fully. Live with intention. This is the greatest gift you can offer to the memory of someone who spent most of his life living in shadow. Monsieur Bellini. Marco's death left Clara with questions that would take years to answer. Questions about the nature of his world, the reality of his crimes, the motivations behind his kindness. Questions about whether his death was random violence, or whether it was connected to the life he lived. Questions about what happens when someone like Marco Bellini, someone who operated in darkness, tries to step into the light and help someone else. But here's what Clara understood in that moment. Sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who choose mercy. Sometimes the most valuable gifts are the ones that require no repayment, except that we, in turn, help others. What would you do if you were Clara? How would you honor Marco's memory? Subscribe to our channel right now. The final chapter is coming and you won't believe how Clara's story concludes. 5 years later, Clara stood in a different cafe than the one where she had spilled coffee on Marco Bellini. This cafe was smaller, quieter, located in Washington Heights in northern Manhattan. Through the window she could see the Hudson River, the autumn light catching the water and turning it to silver. The walls of the cafe were covered with photographs, young people mostly from various backgrounds at various stages of their lives. All of them had stories. All of them had been given opportunities. All of them had been helped. Clara was 29 now. She had graduated from Hunter College with highest honors. She had gone on to graduate school at Columbia, earning her MBA in nonprofit management. She now ran an organization called Bellini's Promise, a foundation that provided financial support and mentorship to young people in Brooklyn and Manhattan who were struggling, who were talented, who had potential that was being wasted because of economic circumstances. The foundation was fully funded by the trust that Marco Bellini had created. It had helped over 300 young people in its first 5 years of operation. Each one of them had received education, support, and the belief that their lives could be different from what circumstances had dictated. This morning, Clara was meeting with a young woman named Sophia. She was 19, working double shifts as a hostess in a restaurant in Brooklyn while attending community college in the evenings. She was talented in ways she hadn't yet recognized in herself. She was exhausted in ways that seemed too deep to overcome. She was, in short, everything that Clara had once been. Sophia arrived with visible anxiety, the same anxiety that Clara had felt 5 years ago when entering Aqua Alta for the first time. Clara recognized it immediately because it lived in her own memory. She made Sophia a cup of coffee, good coffee, freshly made, not burnt, and sat across from her at a small table in the corner of the cafe. "Tell me your story," Clara said quietly. And Sophia began to talk. She talked about her family's economic struggles. She talked about her dreams of becoming a teacher. She talked about the exhaustion of trying. The plaque outside Acqua Alta had been updated. It now read, Acqua Alta Restaurant and the Bellini Foundation for Opportunity. Inside, the space had been transformed. The private dining room where Marco had once interviewed Clara had been converted into an office and meeting space. The main dining area remained largely unchanged, but the walls now featured the photographs of hundreds of young people who had been helped by the foundation. Clara, now 39 years old, walked through the restaurant checking final details for an evening event. Tonight was the anniversary dinner. 10 years since Marco Bellini had reached out to her. 10 years since she had spilled coffee and her life had changed forever. She had invited everyone she could find, everyone who had been part of this journey. Sophia, now 29, had become a high school teacher working in one of Brooklyn's most underserved neighborhoods. She had brought 3 other young people with her, students she was mentoring, students who had been helped by the foundation. There was a surgeon who had been the foundation's first grant recipient. There was a lawyer working for a nonprofit focused on criminal justice reform. There was a musician, a social worker, an engineer, a businesswoman, each one of them a success story that had started with belief, with investment, with someone saying yes to their potential. Rosa's son, Marco's nephew, had arrived earlier in the day. He had taken over his uncle's legitimate business interests and had become one of the foundation's major donors. He didn't speak about the darker aspects of his uncle's life, but he acknowledged them. He acknowledged that Marco had been a complex man, a man capable of both harm and healing, a man who had recognized his own capacity for redemption and had attempted to pursue it, however late in life. As evening fell and the guests began to arrive, Clara stood in the restaurant and allowed herself to feel the weight and the beauty of what had been created. What had started with a spilled cup of coffee had grown into something larger than any single person, larger than any single act of kindness. It had become a movement, a philosophy, a commitment to the belief that everyone deserves a chance, that potential should not be wasted, that kindness is not only possible, but necessary. The evening progressed with dinner and conversation, with stories shared and memories honored. People talked about their lives, about how the foundation had changed them, about the people they in turn had helped. It was a celebration not just of Clara's journey, but of the ripple effect that kindness creates when it is given freely and received with gratitude. Near the end of the evening, Clara stood at the bar of the restaurant, looking at the photograph of Marco that hung in a place of honor near the kitchen. It was a rare image, him smiling genuinely, caught in a moment when his guard was down, when his humanity was visible on his face. Someone had brought her a handwritten note, left at the restaurant by an anonymous source. She opened it and read the message. Dear Clara, you don't know me, but I know what you've done. I know about the foundation. I know about the young people you've helped. I wanted you to know that Marco Bellini's legacy extends further than you realize. His life, despite its darkness, created light. His death, despite its tragedy, created purpose. I am writing this to tell you that I have started a similar foundation in Chicago, inspired by your work, inspired by the belief that kindness can be systemic, that goodness can be organized and directed toward those most in need. Thank you for showing the world that it's possible to transform tragedy into purpose, that it's possible to honor someone by continuing their work. A friend. Clara read the note 3 times, tears streaming down her face. She thought about Marco, about the life he had lived, about the choice he had made at the end to invest in her, to believe in her, to help her become more than she thought possible. She understood now what he had meant in that final letter, that his life belonged to him and to the choices he had made, but that his death could belong to something greater, to the movement of kindness and opportunity that would continue long after he was gone. She thought about all the people in the restaurant tonight. She thought about all the people who had been helped by the foundation. She thought about all the people who would be helped in the future, by her and by countless others who were carrying forward this work. And she thought about coffee, about that spilled cup of coffee that had changed everything, that had served as the beginning of something beautiful, that had proved once and for all that sometimes the most important moments in our lives are the ones we least expect. This is the end of Clara's story, but it is not the end of Marco's legacy. It is not the end of the ripple effect created by one act of kindness on a cold morning in Brooklyn. The truth is, you don't know whose life you might change. You don't know whose future might be transformed by a single act of belief, a single investment of your resources, a single choice to help instead of harm. Marco Bellini was a man who lived in darkness for most of his life, but he ended his life with light. He showed us that redemption is possible, that change is possible, that it is never too late to choose kindness. Clara Rossi spilled coffee on a mafia boss and learned that mercy is real. She learned that sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who choose gentleness. She learned that investing in other people is the truest investment you can make. If this story has moved you, if it has made you think about the power you have to change someone's life, then do something about it. Find someone who needs help. Find someone with potential. Find someone who is exhausted and desperate and brilliant and overlooked, and help them. Because the greatest legacy we can leave behind is not money or fame or power. The greatest legacy is the impact we have had on other people's lives. Subscribe to our channel to watch more stories like this. Stories about transformation, redemption, and the power of human kindness to change the world. Like this video. Share it. Tell someone about it. Because this story deserves to be heard. Because these messages deserve to be spread. And remember, you have the power to be someone's Marco Bellini. You have the power to change someone's life. The question is, will you? Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next story.